I'm Carol Westby from Bilingual Multicultural Services in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I'm presenting on the topic Digital Education for 21st Century Children, a focus on digital literacy. Just because kids know how to use Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram doesn't mean they know how to use technology to enhance their learning. There are two components to digital literacy. There's the ability to comprehend digital media and the ability to use digital media to generate creative content. And then there's digital citizenship. That's the ability to evaluate digital content, including accuracy, truthfulness, and issues of safety when using digital media, as well as how to act online. At the end of this session, you should be able to describe a multiliteracies approach for teaching students to comprehend and produce digital multimedia and employ strategies to teach digital citizenship principles to students to enable them to use digital media safely and responsibly. Now, the term multiliteracies arose in the mid-1990s. There was an international group of linguists, educators, child language specialists who met in New London, New Hampshire to talk about the effects of changing technologies on literacy. And they said there were two aspects that were being changed. One, that digital technologies were using multimodal text, not just print text. And the other aspect of digital technologies was that they were available to people throughout the world. And so we were now engaging in people from very diverse social and cultural backgrounds. And so they said a multiliteracy approach to literacy education in the 21st century had to consider the multimodal nature of literacy and the diverse social and cultural contexts. Now, multimodal texts require that you make meaning in different ways. We know how to make meaning from written printed text. I think many of us have had less understanding of what does it mean to be literate with visual text, with auditory, with spatial patterns, with gestures. And multimedia uses all of these different modalities simultaneously. Now, many of those modalities have crept into print text. We see that happening with this science text. We see some of the traditional print here, but we also see photographs and graphics. We see some other print areas. We see a QR code that's going to take you off to an internet site. And when we look at these, we realize there are multiple modalities that have been presented on these pages. And each of these different kinds of text requires different kinds of processing. And there's nothing on the pages that tells students where to begin. What order do you try processing these different texts in? Now, a multiliteracies approach to digital education has three components. There's why do you want to use this approach? There's what is the approach, and then there's how do you do it. First, why a multiliteracies approach? Well, for the 21st century, we need persons with a comfortable, flexible sense of identity who can collaborate and negotiate with others who are different from themselves. And if people are going to be able to do that, they have to have multiple modes of meaning making, and they have to realize that different cultural, social groups have different ways of making meaning. Now, the what of multiliteracies. We know what we call the design or structure for printed text. You know the vocabulary, you know the syntax you're to use, you know the organization for a narrative or expository text. All 5 of those modalities have one or more designs. They each have a structure to them. They each have a grammar, a way they organize their ideas, and a way all of those ideas are put together in some kind of framework. And so students must be aware of the available designs. Then they must know what they have to do to interpret or make meaning from each of those designs. And then they must take that knowledge, interpret the designs, and transform them for their own purpose. Here we say they're engaging in the redesign. They're producing their own multimodal digital literacies. Now, for print, we usually talk about reading and writing. For digital literacy, Yancey and Bull say we should use the terms consuming and producing, because with digital media, we're doing so much more than just reading. We're consuming visual, gestural, auditory, print information. And similarly, we're not just writing, we're producing multimodal texts. So you want students to know the nature of the designs for these 5 modalities. Okay, you're probably quite good at talking about the print text design. What about the visual modality? Students need to know about perspective taking and when you want a still shot and a moving shot, and what layout should you use. What about with the audio? What kind of music, the loudness, the pitch? How is it integrated with the other modalities? What are you trying to convey with the sound and music that you've selected? What about spatial relationships, proximity or distance? And what about gestural cues, facial expressions, body language, gaze direction, clothing? We realize that many of our students with language impairment and autism have marked difficulty interpreting the gestural modality. Then students have to have the meta language to talk about those designs. They have to know the codes and conventions for what we call the semiotic system. Every modality has a semiotic system. That's the meaning within the system, and how is that meaning conveyed in terms of the vocabulary and the organization of the information. And when students are producing multimodal text, they're having to integrate across all these different modalities. They're having to think about how to lay out the information on a page, even what kind of fonts might they want to select, because how will that affect the meaning of what they're trying to convey. Students need a metacognitive awareness. They need to be aware of their thinking processes when they're consuming and producing. I'm thinking, I'm reflecting, I'm planning, I'm organizing, I'm integrating, I'm generating, I'm predicting. They need to be able to describe and navigate online text. They need to understand the technologies that are associated with the producing and consuming, and they have to be aware that they've got to synthesize information across sites, not just copy it down. Now, how do you teach digital literacy using a multiliteracy framework? There are 4 components to this. First, there's the experiencing multiliteracies in naturalistic context. We call this situated practice. And then you want to engage in overt instruction, conceptualizing. You want to explicitly teach the students the language they need to talk about those modalities, the vocabulary and the syntax and the genre structure. And then you want them to be able to analyze what they're accessing through digital media. You want them to compare and contrast different websites, realizing there are different perspectives and different modalities might be comparing and creating information that is different. So analyzing the multimedia that you're exploring. And then you want to take all that they've learned and have them apply it to what we call transform practice, where you're using multiliteracies in new and creative ways. Now, shortly after I began using a multiliteracy approach in my own therapy, I introduced my friend Ella Engelbrecht to it. And Ella and I have both done considerable work with Indigenous students in the US around literacy, because the Indigenous students tend to have the lowest literacy scores of any ethnic groups in the US. And Ella was really taken by the multiliteracy approach because he said it's perfect for the Indigenous students. They're so much more oriented to the visual, the auditory, the gestural than the print. And so she and her Suquamish Native colleague, Michael Pavel, developed a whole multiliteracy curriculum for Northwest Native students. And they began by helping the students create video documentaries of the artwork, the pottery, the wood carving, aspects of their culture that were so important. And the kids were learning how to use camera angles, zoom in, zoom out, foreground, background. They talked about the kinds of sound and noise and music they would want to incorporate. Because again, within the Native culture, the drum playing and the flute playing and the chanting are very important parts of the culture. Dance and the regalia for the dance are very communicative. Every year, Albuquerque hosts the Gathering of the Nations, and we get thousands of Indigenous peoples from throughout North America coming.
When we get together and we dance, we are expressing our way to the Creator. We are expressing our way to our ancestors for preserving this beautiful way of life that was once taken from us. Our regalias, they speak of our history of who we are.
So dance is conveying stories and history of the culture. Spatial modalities. In most of the tribes, the landscape, the ecosystem is extremely important because it's the way they survive. And so the students are very often quite familiar with their landscape and environment. But Ella and Michael added to that by helping them learn how to use internet resources to gather additional information, such as using the geographic information system as a tool for mapping landscape attributes in their areas. The Indigenous tribes have worldviews that focus on a balance among mind, body, spirit, and environment. As non-natives, we do have access to often the Indigenous creation stories, and those can be shared. We do have to be careful in the spiritual modality, however, because there are some areas that as non-natives we are not to have access to. And then there needs to be knowledge of the linguistic modality. And that's very essential for many of the Indigenous students. Explicit teaching of the vocabulary, syntax, and structure of English texts. In the process of developing this curriculum, they also were participants in the development of The Shadow of the Salmon, a documentary on salmon issues in the Northwest. And the Northwest Native tribes, many of them are quite dependent on the salmon. They've been their basis for economy. And in a number of recent years now, there have been a number of problems with the salmon. Salmon are disappearing. We don't fully know why. There's also tension between the tribes and the government over who has rights to fish for the salmon. So there's a lot of discussion and concern around these areas. So the curriculum unit was built around issues of the salmon. And here are then these 4 multiliteracy components. First, we're starting with situated practice, starting with things that the students knew about. So Ella had them share their experiences about salmon fishing, doing canoe journeys. Watch that video, The Shadow of the Salmon. Talk about how that's similar to your experiences or not similar. Listen to messages from tribal elders. Listen to or read stories from the culture. So you're starting with something that's familiar to them, and you're adding some additional information that would be related or add to their native knowledge. Then you want to engage in overt instruction. You want them to know the language they need to talk about these modalities. Often in lessons, we'll start with a KWL. What do I know? What do I want to know? What do I want to find out? And then when we finish the unit, we'll talk about what you've learned. You want them to talk about their values, the beliefs, their customs. You want them to analyze how are those stories structured? What are the parts of the story? How is the information conveyed? How is the video structured? How is the video different than a book? And then you want them to explore resources on the internet, exploring multiple sources about attitudes about the salmon, government, and native approaches, reading about some of the treaty history between the natives and the federal government, looking at the kinds of solutions or explanations people are giving. Why are the salmon disappearing? What can we do to save them? And in the process, they're learning to compare and contrast. They're comparing and contrasting Western and Native ideas. What are similarities? What are differences? Why are there differences? You want them to evaluate conclusions that people make. And then you want them to make some use out of what they've learned. How do they interpret what they've learned? One group of Ella students wrote a letter to the editor of the local newspaper, presenting a persuasive argument in relation to historical events, such as treaties between the US government and the American Indian tribes and the current status of the salmon. That took a tremendous amount of internet research, looking at multiple opinions and tracing back the US history of Indian US agreements. This is my local area, Albuquerque. I live in the high desert. We get maybe about 5 inches of rain a year. The mountains are on our east side. And during the summer, we have a summer monsoon season. We'll get some rain in town, but a lot of the rain hits the mountains and then comes rolling down off the mountains. And the city has these concrete arroyos that carry the rushing water down to the river. This past summer, we had a 12-foot wall of water traveling at 40 miles an hour, rushing down one of these arroyos, and it swept several people away. Well, because of our environment, it's very important that our students understand what it's like to live in the desert, the need for water conservation, the need for arroyo safety. And so all fifth graders have a unit dealing with water conservation and arroyo safety. And we've used a multiliteracies approach for this unit. And the concepts are all laid on the situated practice of being familiar with your homeland, your environment, your walks in the desert, your walks in the mountains. Now, what we have here is our lesson plan. And the format for this lesson plan comes from a website. It's called newlearningonline.com. It's a superb website for finding all kinds of information about how to teach using a multiliteracies approach. So here's the lesson plan for our 4 components of multiliteracy education. We start with experiencing. We ask the students, tell us about their personal stories of being out in the desert, hiking up in the mountains. We take them on hikes, we take videos and photos and talk about what the land is like. We also take them to our Natural History Museum, where you learn that many thousands of years ago, New Mexico wasn't a desert, it was part of the ocean. Then you want to conceptualize. We're going to teach the vocabulary for water conservation, climate change, weather, temperature. We're also going to teach them cause-effect structures so they can talk about when something happens, this occurs because. They also had to learn the terminology for meteorological equipment that they were learning to use. And then on the internet, we want them to begin exploring other climates. Not every place around the world looks like Albuquerque. Not everyone has such limited water. How do people work in different areas if they have more or less water? And then you want them critically analyzing. They have a whole series of science lessons they're going to do where they're going to have to explain why the activities have worked as they have. And we also want them to realize that different people have different ideas about water conservation, climate change, arroyo safety issues. And so some of the students did community surveys of people in different parts of town because attitudes tend to be different whether you're living close to the river or close to the mountain. And then again, you want them to make some use of what they've learned. Now, I like students to be able to tell coherent personal stories. So one way of integrating information they've learned through this unit is creating a journal, a blog online where they record their ideas of what they're learning and how their ideas are changing. One group of our students made a PowerPoint presentation on arroyo safety that they shared with the kindergarten and first grade children. And another group made a PSA video talking about different ways that people could conserve water. Well, those are strategies and ideas for using a multiliteracy approach to teach children to be good consumers and producers of digital media. Now, students must also be digital citizens. They have to use technology responsibly to learn, to create, and to participate. We can't just tell our students, don't use digital media or be careful, and then put our heads in the sand. Instead, we need to teach them how to be safe and responsible digital citizens because they're going to be using digital media. Here are 2 of my favorite resources for this topic. commonsense.org has a superb website. They evaluate all kinds of digital media. They have lesson plans for digital citizenship across the whole age range. They have games to play to teach digital citizenship. And then there's the new book, Digital for Good, written by Richard Collada, CEO of the International Society for Technology and Education. And he says, again, our students are exposed to digital. How do we help them use it in good ways? Now, digital citizens must be balanced. They have to prioritize their online and offline time. They have to be alert to safety issues. They have to be informed. They have to be able to evaluate the truthfulness and the perspective of what they're encountering online. And they need to be inclusive. That means they need to treat people online with respect and empathy. Let's look at each of these in a little more detail. First, they need to have balanced digital lives. They need to make informed decisions about how to prioritize their time in virtual and physical spaces. You want them thinking about using media in ways that feels healthy and in balance with their other life activities. They've got to spend time with family and friends and at school. And so you want them thinking about what makes a healthy choice. And there are three aspects: what media you're using, when you're using it, and how much you're using it. commonsense.org suggests you have students take a couple days and fill out this kind of chart. I watched Troll Hunters on Netflix on my iPad late Wednesday night in bed until I fell asleep for about 2.5 hours. Or I played Fortnite on my parents' computer on Saturday, pretty much all day, probably about 6 hours. Often students are not aware of how much time they're online. Healthychildren.org has an interactive page where you have this column that represents 24 hours, and you talk with the students about what you have to do every day and how much time you need to do it. So you might begin and say, okay, we got to sleep. How much do you sleep every day? Let's say the student says 10 hours. So you write sleep in that box, and then it pops it up to eat up 10 hours of the 24. You say, all right, what else do you have to do? Oh, school. Okay, how many hours school? Oh, 6 hours. What you start finding, if you put in that I'm going to spend 4 hours on my computer every night, you realize you might have to cut out eating or washing, or you might have to reduce sleeping. So it's a way of getting students to really think about how much time do you have for these different activities. Collada has 4 young children himself, and he says they're very alert to new apps that come out, but they have to justify to their parents why they want them. And so even by elementary school, the kids had to be able to say how the app would connect them with other people, what kinds of interactions it would allow, whether it would be habit inducing, was it appropriate for their age, their interest, what did other reviewers say about it. So they had to be able to make a good case to get items for their digital media. Students need to be alert that there are safety issues online. There's a book that introduces this idea to children, that you need to know who you're talking to. Here, Popcorn the chicken finds an iPhone and she pecks at it and she gets a text message, and she pecks some more and she gets more messages. Oh, she's so excited. She starts to ignore her other friends because she's just spending all her time on the iPhone. And she has so many friends now that are messaging her. And she decides she's going to host a party for her internet friends. And here's who shows up. She didn't know she was talking with wolves. Students need to understand what kind of information is private and they should never share. Don't share your full name and birth date and where you live. Only share that information that could not be used to track you down or be used by someone for some other inappropriate purposes. Now, you also need to introduce this idea of phishing. This can be complex for students we deal with because we're often dealing with students with language impairment, and this is figurative language, phishing on the internet. And what we're meaning is that somebody is pretending there's someone you might know, and they're trying to trick you into giving them something. So it's like they're treating you as a fish, and they're trying to catch you. They're trying to trick you into giving them some information. Get students alert to what might be some clues that someone is fishing them. The sense of urgency. Click here within the next 5 seconds or you'll never get to play this game again. Spelling errors in the message. Or you have to be careful even if you receive a photo of a friend with some message attached. It's not necessarily the message from that friend. Also, beware of something that's too good to be true. Type your name in this box and win $100. Also introduce the idea of clickbait. That's an image or a headline that makes you want to click on it to see what's there. And that's figurative language again. And then we use additional figurative language with the kids saying, it's taking you down the rabbit hole. You start clicking on one thing after another. It's like you're going down the rabbit hole and you don't know where you're going to go. And it's getting darker and you're going to get in trouble down there. What are some clues of clickbait? This is impossible. You'd never believe it. Think your cat loves you. It's actually plotting to make you sick. Or it tries to shock you. You'll never believe this. Or it's using a celebrity to get your attention. Have students evaluate information on the web. Yeah, I think man kisses a king cobra is clickbait. 5 pictures that show this is a beautiful sunset. No, that seems pretty legitimate. And then students must be informed users. I know Barbara Aaron has a session on how to help students with language impairment be informed users of media. There's so much we could talk about here. I'll only talk about one piece, and that's the idea of seeing is believing. Are the visual things we're seeing online real or fake? You want to introduce students to the idea that people alter things on the web. They change the way something looks. Now, sometimes the change is obvious. So a tiger head on a parakeet body is obvious. But the modifications or alterations to these 2 photos are a little less obvious. So you want students to think about, why would someone alter material on the web, and how could I tell if it was altered? Give them some practice in doing that. So here they're looking at the 2 photos, and well, it was altered. They got rid of the cracks and tears in the photo, and they lightened the woman's features, and maybe they did that so you could see her more clearly. And maybe she's really a famous person, and that was an old photo and it was falling apart, and people really want to remember her. They want a good view of her. What about the way this photo has been altered? Well, they changed her complexion. They made it smoother. They removed her wrinkles, and her face and chin were made skinnier, and they added more hair. Why do you think it was altered? What were they trying to accomplish? Well, maybe they were trying to sell more magazines, or maybe they were selling beauty products and they wanted to show that they could really work. It's unfortunate that sometimes children have gotten hurt because they have believed what they see on the internet. And these videos by Zach King have sometimes been problematic for children.
This is how I hitchhike.
Woo! And kids try to replicate what Zach King does, not realizing that his videos are always altered. And the last component of citizenship we'll discuss is inclusivity. You want to have positive relationships with people. You want to be open to hearing and recognizing multiple viewpoints. You want to treat people with respect and empathy. Unfortunately, there are quite a number of studies that show for both adults and children, more time on digital media, less empathic responding. We think that's because when you're interacting on the internet, you usually are not seeing how people are responding to what you're saying and doing. DigiDuck is a series of books out of Britain to help young children also learn about aspects of digital citizenship. And here, Digi's on his computer and someone sends him a silly photo of his good friend, Proud Pig. And it's a really nasty photo of Pig. It makes him look really bad. And Digi laughs at it and very quickly sends it to a whole bunch of other friends. And Proud Pig learns of what Digi has done. And he is so hurt. And he thinks that Digi is no longer his friend. So students need to be aware of how someone is responding to what they do on the net. And you're wanting students to be aware, just because the word sounds okay to them, it might not sound okay to somebody else. Get students to think about what kinds of things are okay to say and not okay to say. And then Common Core suggests the strategy stop. When you see something nasty online, step away. Tell a trusted adult. Have adults okay sites. This is particularly true for young children. Pause and think. Do not be so quick to just pass information on. Here's a little video from Common Core of helping children learn about how people can feel about words you use. Guts has been playing a game with some of his friends and they leave and some other kids join the game. They call him a slowpoke. He's weird. They call him a dummy when he makes a mistake. And here they're showing you how Guts feels. The kids that are doing this have no idea of how Guts is feeling. Why would they be doing those things? So you want students to develop empathy. Realize how many of our students, this is an issue. Children with language impairment and certainly children on the spectrum have marked deficits in developing perspective of others and understanding how someone else thinks and feels. There's one activity that you have students discuss. Rani loves a website where she can play in a virtual world and chat with other players. Lately, Rani's been playing in a new area, but she started receiving some mean messages from other players. What are you doing here? You don't belong. Yeah, go away. You're ruining the game. How would you feel if you were Rani reading those messages? Boy, it's sad. They don't want me. Well, why do you think someone that doesn't even know her would write these messages? Well, maybe they're just kidding, or maybe they feel bad themselves. They want to make someone else feel bad. And then what would you tell her to do? Teach her how to use the stop system. So in this brief time, I've just tried giving you an overview of how do we use a multiliteracies approach to enable students to be good digital media consumers and producers, and how to be good digital citizens.